Thank you so much for coming this evening. It's so exciting for me to be able to talk about these women who are often forgotten by historians, but were incredibly important to their communities and important to the country. I'm sure you've heard the saying before, well-behaved women seldom make history or rarely make history. And I heard that a lot as a young historian, and it really bothered me. Why wouldn't well-behaved women make history? It seemed like the problem of historians, not of the women. And so that's kind of what led me to this point, because these women worked very, very hard, did amazing things, made amazing changes, but never in their own names. It wasn't a time period where most women felt comfortable, necessarily, explaining why change was needed and the things that they needed to do. So this book I wrote was about 6 women that were amazingly important. They did things that changed history, and in their own letters to each other, they said, "We'll never be remembered for this." And so I really thought that was my job to do for them. Most of them never had children, never married, didn't have anyone to speak up for them. And so that's what I've spent my career trying to do, is to make sure these women get written back into history. Because for a long time, the only women that were part of history were either married to someone important or the mother of someone important. It took a long time for history to catch up. In fact, if you look historically, it was only in 1970 that we started talking about women's history. My students think that's a long time ago. But of course it's not, right? And so that's a big part of what it is that I've tried to do and who I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So I write about the women's pages. People, I'm guessing, in this room are slightly familiar with that. Most folks. You are my favorite crowd, by the way. I was born on the second last day of 1970. So I had no idea what the women's pages were. And so I had to learn about it later. And one of the things I think is immensely important is I spoke to a reporter, an editor, several years ago. And she said, I went into the newsroom in 1980, and no one told me there was something I couldn't do. 1980. One generation out, women could do anything. And that's kind of a big deal if you think about it. One generation. The sad part is, in doing that and allowing women to do whatever they wanted to do, we stopped talking about the women's pages. And newspapers did too, because they were inherently embarrassed about how they treated women. Women's pages started in the 1880s and continued into the early 1970s. And that was the only place a woman in a newspaper could work, outside of classifieds and that sort of thing. If you wanted to be a journalist, this is the only thing you could do, was work in the women's pages. And for a long time, including when I went to doc school, nothing good could have ever have happened of these women. And that was literally how it was treated in the history books. Nothing good was in the women's pages. Well, what we learned is that no one ever studied it. That's why everyone assumed it was bad, or nothing good could come from it. There's a saying in journalism school, when it comes to fact-checking, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. In other words, you never make an assumption. And the sad part was no one checked the women's pages. Because what these women were amazing about doing, they could do whatever they wanted. Male management never read the section. Ever. I mean, they write this in their memoirs with pride. So they could do whatever they wanted, which is quite liberating, right? So this is the Miami Herald, this photo right here, and this is in the 1950s. So you can tell it's all women in here, right? So this is Dorothy Journey. She's the women's page editor in the front. You can kind of see a little bit the typewriters, right, and the paper and all that. So they quite literally were in a different room, and at a big newspaper, they were on a separate floor. And the theory was the women could not handle the swearing in the newsroom. Really, they said this all the time. I've read these women's letters. They could curse with the best of them. They were not being protected from anybody. But at the same time, they had this kind of freedom that was never really respected. So they created women's news. In the 1950s in particular, that I'll talk about tonight, and the 1960s, that were amazing. They talked about, for example, having to go through the male newsroom with a raised knee. That's what they called sexual harassment when they didn't have a word for it. But they spoke to each other about this. They knew they weren't getting paid well enough. This was not news to them. They knew that there were stories that weren't being told. And that's what they did. And again, for decades, journalism historians and historians never spoke about it. Because the theory was, what could women know? What could they possibly do? Oh, they did a lot. So this is the Miami Herald, which is one of my favorite papers to research, in part because of World War II and the Servicemen's Pier down in Miami. It was pretty much all Midwestern men. And they came back from the war, and they realized that you didn't have to have the winter that you have in Milwaukee. And they were very happy to come back here. And so these newspapers were huge. There were women's sections that were 50 pages thick. Just the women's section. So you could do whatever you wanted. But it's also always worth mentioning, the New York Times did the same. And so, yeah, they were actually up on the 8th floor. They were 5 floors above where the real news was. But they did really important things that I'll mention to you tonight. So this was typical at every newspaper. In fact, I talked to a woman in Cleveland, and they had a small newsroom. So they went and bought bookshelves so they could create a different room to make sure the women didn't feel comfortable in the newsroom. So, I mean, this was everywhere. It wasn't unique in any way. So the women's news section, and again, every newspaper had a section, and it was called Women's News. It was not a euphemism of any kind. They quite literally said, Women's News. So they had soft news. So we had family, fashion, food, and furnishings. And the theory was, of course, that these things were unimportant. That's why women wrote about it. But think about those 4 concepts for a minute. Don't those 4 things impact your daily life? Just because it wasn't war or crime or politics doesn't mean these things weren't incredibly important. And these women knew that. And that's why they did incredible things. Because the women that covered these concepts never got fired, not a one. Because everything they did that was a little bit outrageous for the 50s and the 60s, their readership loved them. And that was how they knew they were safe to do things that otherwise you couldn't do. They also had lots of brides and wedding news. And again, that might seem traditional or stereotypical for the 1950s and the 1960s. But there were women, particularly in Florida, Louisville, Milwaukee, Fort Lauderdale, in particular Miami. The first time African American women's faces and names ever appeared in the paper were in the bridal section. And every single one of these women's page editors that did that broke the rules to do it. My favorite in Fort Lauderdale was Edie Green, and she was always doing this. And she would always say, "Oh, I didn't know the rule. Oh, I'm so sorry." But once it was there, right, the rule was broken. They'd done it. Advice columns. You were familiar with Dear Abby, right? Nan Landers and that sort of thing. We had the national ones. But every newspaper also had a local one. And that explained how life was changing. Because it would say, you know, these kind of advice columns would have someone write in, and then there'd be the response from sometimes the columnist, but sometimes other readers. My favorite was at the Miami Herald was a lady by the name of Eleanor Hart, and I got to look at her papers, And she had the list of the names that actually wrote in, because you know sometimes you read those and you wonder if someone's really writing in or not, if they're making it up. Actual letters. What do I do about this change? Whether it was desegregating neighborhoods, whether it meant should women work or not. These advice columnists were often working mothers who had to answer letters if that's okay or not. Because the theory was that if women were working, mothers were working, the children would end up somehow in jail. Very common. But these things were incredibly important about understanding our communities in a changing time in the 50s and the 60s. So when I started looking at these folks in the late I guess it was 1995, I was told this stuff wasn't important. So one of the first women I looked at was a lady by the name of Jeannie Volz. She probably doesn't mean anything to you. She was a good friend of James Beard. Yeah? And it was the James Beards and the Craig Claibornes that kind of left these women behind because they became so famous they oversaw. So Jeannie Volz was the first person in this country to write about barbecue as significant food. And now we all think it's good food, right? And there's Food Network shows about it. But she was the first one to do a lot of these things. So she was, like many of the women I looked at, she graduated from college during World War II. It was really the only time that women could do anything other than the women's sections, because the men were off at war, of course. So after the war, she moved to Miami. She had 2 little kids. And she went to the doctor with a bad back, and the doctor said, "A stay-at-home mom is too much work for you. Go be a journalist." And if you've ever had young kids, you know what he meant, right? And that's what she did. So by 1960, she didn't like the amount of money she was making, asked for a raise. They said no, so she went to the LA Times, where she also wrote just amazing nutrition stories, some of the first great food stories, and eventually goes to New York and writes for Women's Day. But this woman was so important, considering that history said the women weren't important, that it seems strange to me, right? Was she an outlier? So I wrote a book. There were 60 women I looked at, and every single one was amazing. Every single one broke ground rules, did everything that didn't seem to make sense, that women were not important in news, and that the women's sections were unimportant. 60 of them. There were 2 men. 60. And their stories were amazing in the things that they did. They went undercover to do investigative work. They fought with local grocers who were trying to scam homemakers out of things. And the one thing I thought was truly amazing, very little Jell-O. Because that's the stereotype, right? There was no real good cooking in the 50s and 60s. It was all Jell-O. I found very little Jell-O. Some good casseroles, but very little Jell-O. So then, in looking back also, and knowing that the League of Women Voters was going to be here tonight, was how important these women's sections were about covering club women. Because that's one thing that historians often forget. Club women changed their communities. They created libraries and kindergartens and juvenile justice systems, and they socialized with each other, and they found a place outside of their homes. After World War II, in the 1950s in Miami, there were 100 women's clubs. I would argue that's probably too many, just based on what some of them did. But the point was, they were doing these things, and almost always in someone else's name. They would raise money because it was a fashion show or it was a bake sale, right? Safe women's work. But they changed things. And then they named it for the mayor or someone else. They never got the credit for what they did. But they were incredibly important in what they created. This picture doesn't work as well tonight as it normally does for my talks. It's kind of hard to tell, but they have veils over their faces with their fancy hats, and they have white gloves on. This was before air conditioning. I'm just saying, tonight it almost seems comfortable. But this was a time period, right, where women had to act and do things a certain way. And when I look at the letters that these women sent to each other, they said, we can do anything in high heels and lipstick. Because it was a different time, right? And you had to kind of abide by the rules that were happening. And it's also, again, as I mentioned earlier, World War II is central to the women's pages. Prior to World War II, women could work in the women's pages, nowhere else. When men went away, they could suddenly cover everything. There's only two things women's page editors could not cover. Football, seriously, and executions. So do with that what you will. But seriously, that was across the country. There were the only two things women couldn't cover. So after World War II, most women had to sign papers saying that they would go back to their sections. And not all were happy about it, of course. But what was fascinating is how women's news changed. The very first stories that ever appeared about child abuse were in the women's sections after World War II. Because it didn't used to be a crime to hit your kid. It didn't. And these women wrote stories, talked to lawmakers, did things. Domestic violence, pay inequity. This was stuff they wrote about because it happened to them. And that was a different thing if World War II hadn't happened. And they hadn't covered these kinds of things. And they spoke about it quite a bit. So the first woman, and her picture was up there earlier, is Dorothy Journey. When I talk about our well-behaved women. If you ever think that you had a bad job in your life, Dorothy Journey's father was a publisher. She had to sell advertising for the newspaper during the Great Depression. Right? Her mother was the first woman to be elected to the Indiana legislature. So she said that she learned her journalism and her feminism in her house. She got a degree from Northwestern. She ended up down here. During World War II, she did work in D.C. She had to train a young man 20 years younger than her to take over her job after the war, which was not unusual during the time. Not great, but not unusual. She ended down here in Miami. And so she worked at the Miami News and then eventually the Miami Herald with very progressive ideas about women's roles and newspapers. So she gets to meet Marie Anderson, the woman here on the left. Marie was the first woman to head the Junior League, the first single woman, I should say, to head the Junior League. This was a big deal in the 1940s. Very big deal. What was great about her, she was a seventh generation Floridian in the 1940s, which, if you think about it, that's pretty unique. She had so much money that during the Great Depression, she golfed. Just to understand where she was coming from. So she's Junior League, quite wealthy. Her dad was a federal judge. So when she becomes friends with Dorothy, she learns the policies of women in journalism. No one's firing her. So she did amazing things in Miami because no one was firing the Junior League daughter of the federal judge lady. And so she could do things that no one else could do. And I should also mention they had a lot of fun. These were great progressive women, but their letters back and forth about their parties were quite something. I mean, I can't imagine what their social media would look like. I mean, their Pinterest pages would be amazing. But really, they did these amazingly great things. And then was Marjorie Paxson. Marjorie went to the University of Missouri's journalism school, which is kind of the famous big one. So she was in school when World War II was announced. And she mentioned that a week later, all the men were gone. So she could do things like the others that could never have been done before. And was able to take those things into a new place. So she eventually, she works for Wire Service, she works in Texas, and then she ends up working with the two women I just showed you, Dorothy and Marie. She ends up being the fourth woman to be a publisher in the Gannett chain. That's USA Today, Florida Today, that sort of thing. And she ended up never marrying and having all sorts of money as a publisher. And so she established the National Women in Media Collection, the only archive in our country devoted to women who were journalists of this time period. And of course, she pressured all of her friends to donate their papers, which was amazing. And really was a groundbreaker in a lot of what she did, because there were so few women doing this at this point in time. The fourth woman that's in the book is Vera Glasser. Vera was from St. Louis, and she was the valedictorian of her class based on GPA. A young man who had just moved into the St. Louis district where she was, had a lower GPA, but they didn't want a woman to be the valedictorian. So they gave that award to him, and she said, "I never forgot that." And she went on to do some pretty amazing things, as I'll tell you about tonight. But it is amazing how these moments change these women, considering that much of our history says, well, it wasn't until the 1970s that women understood inequity. They lived it. They knew it. They experienced it. They were not happy about it. So Vera is one of my favorites. Vera had two daughters that I'm very lucky to be able to talk to. One of the things that Vera is best known for is from the Nixon press conference. So Vera wrote for a national wire service, tiny one. So this was President Nixon's second televised press conference. This was back when it was new, right? It wasn't that big of a thing at the time. So she got to ask a question. And this was a point in time that any female reporter that asked a question was laughed at. Like loudly, like not even subtly. So she got a chance to ask a question. So she said to Nixon, "There's no women in your cabinet, what are you going to do about it?" And that question, and he actually laughs at her at first too, kind of almost forgetting he's on TV. And that became national news, just asking that question because there were no women in the cabinet. So she gets a phone call from Catherine East, which is another woman in my politics book. Catherine East worked for the government, and the government was the federal government was so unique in some ways I don't think we talk about, in that it was equal. Women got months off maternity leave in the 40s and 50s. Like much, we don't have that now. And because they were on these federal job guidelines, they actually had equal pay in a time when that wasn't something anyone talked about. So Catherine East gave Vera a phone call and said, "I heard your question on TV. I have all the stats you need." And so they really worked in tandem. So what would happen for Catherine, who was a government employee, and this sounds silly now, I think, in some ways, particularly with email, she had access to a copy machine, which is really a big deal for a while there. So she would copy all these women's page articles and send them to people to make sure all these women were connected about inequities and why it was important and what they could do. And so Catherine East made sure that these women were connected in a way that they never had been before. She's the one that started NOW, the National Organization of Women. But no one really knows about it. People talk about it after she died. And I went through her papers and found all the information. But she worked for the government and she was afraid people would find out. So I have her canceled check where she puts, "Make this anonymous." She was connected, she knew. She would be in meetings with the president, top officials, and then she would anonymously send the information to the women's page editors and go, "Here's your story." The women would write the story, and then she'd bring it back. "Why aren't we doing anything about this?" And she did this all of the time, and you could see example after example in their papers, because that was the one way, again, they could politic politely. that they could find that space. And luckily they saved everything. So I could see this time and again. The 6 women I'm talking about tonight also all did oral histories, which is very, very lucky for me too, to hear about what they had done, because it's not usual for these kinds of women. My last woman that's in the book is a woman by the name of Kate Clarenbach, that I'm guessing no one knows. I almost never got a hand either. Folks know who this is right here? Yeah, that's why you don't know Kay. Kay was the organizer. Kay was the first head of NOW. And I've read a lot about Betty, and if you're going to be first, sometimes you got to tick people off, and you got to be a little bit aggressive and rough, right? That's what happens. Kate Clarenbach was from Madison, Wisconsin. She knew how to get people to get along. She had 4 children. One of her 4 children told me she would answer the phone, this is back in the day before you had caller ID and such. Her daughter would answer the phone, and if it was Betty, she'd go, "My mom is busy." She actually had a daughter whose job it was, "I can't deal with Betty tonight. It's too much." But Kate Clarenbach, she got her undergrad, her master's degree, and her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in politics, political science. The whole time she was there, she could not drink coffee because it was called a Rathskeller, and it was just for men. And she said, and again, this is the 40s, beginning of her academic career, she said, "I'd never walked so slowly in my life. I'd walk through there and let them know I existed." And after she married her husband, and they did a lot of work together, she ended up being an administrator at the University of Wisconsin. He said, "I hate speaking in public." So she took over and did all the work for the family, and he became a real estate agent. Because the real estate agent could pick the kids up from the bus stop, right? And we know that lots of women make those kinds of choices. And I love that about them because they were such equal partners. They made that decision as a couple, that he would do these things so that she could have the career that she had. And when she became the head of NOW, she's the one that collected money to create NOW in Washington, D.C., commissioned the Status of Women meeting. In fact, she saved the napkin that they were writing on the day they started it. So a lot of women's history is based on her decision-making doing that. And so they said, "Well, then you need to move to Washington, D.C. so you can do this." And she's like, "No, I'm fine in Madison." And Madison's a lovely town, but, it's not near stuff. And she never left. And people have often said, well, she was so marginalized being in Madison. I think she loved the marginalization. She found her space. And she could do everything she wanted to. She could just do it her way. And I think that was a large part of what she was doing. So these 6 women were all connected in different ways. I can see it in their letters, in the things that they did, in the moments they were together. So moving on just a bit, President Nixon's task force on women. So I mentioned to you Catherine East, longtime government employee. She's one of the heads of this. So President Nixon decides he's going to follow up on these commissions on the status of women, which all showed that women were being discriminated against and didn't have equal rights. So he makes this great big mistake. Oh, he's made many mistakes, but this one mistake that Nixon made. He put Vera Glasser on this. The first time a journalist is put on a government committee. You see where I'm going, right? So they produce a matter of simple justice. About this thick, not shocking for the time period. I think this was 1971 or 1972, that laws were inequitable, women weren't being paid well, all the kinds of things, right? And it was so bad that the White House, it's 1970 now I'm looking at it, Nixon decides they're not going to let the public have it because it's so bad. It's really demonstrating how bad women have had it. So they decide they're just not going to publish it. Vera's on it, you got it. Vera's got the stuff. So Vera has this, and the White House isn't going to publish it. So Vera gives it to Marie Anderson. The Miami Herald was the only newspaper that published it. As I mentioned earlier, Marie had status and money. She herself financed printouts of part of this. You could send out for free if you were in Miami to get it. And of course, once the Miami Herald had it, then the Washington Post and the New York Times, everyone else did it. But this only exists at that time period if Vera gives it to Marie Anderson. Again, Marie's not worried about getting fired because she's got this position. But the White House wasn't going to give this to folks, even though, again, it was quite thick, and you can find it online now relatively cheaply. And I think this stuff is incredibly important because it doesn't necessarily go away, because part of a matter of simple justice, and what many of these women looked at, was the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. This is an editorial cartoon from the Miami Herald, where the Florida legislature once again denies the passage of the ERA. And remember, they never really passed suffrage. They did it kind of as a joke in the late 60s symbolically, but it's not been great, right? And each one of these groups pushed for the ERA vote. And the things that were talked about at that period of time against the Equal Rights Amendment were things like women shouldn't be in the military, which of course they are now, and we still have actually a volunteer draft, right? Incredibly concerned about women playing football. There was an amazing amount of concern about women playing football. And some do, right? Some do. But it's not like it's been an issue, right? And this idea that men and women would use the same bathroom, which of course means we got to get rid of Starbucks, right? I mean, the concepts against that. And if you go back and you look at the women's section, there was real discussion about this. What did it mean? Versus what was on the front pages or the editorial sections, which were very, very limited in true discussions. Because part of the challenge of those who did not want the Equal Rights Amendment were the fact that women couldn't have credit cards, couldn't rent their own apartments, and if they did these things and got married, those things went away. The number of women's page editors, and again, I ended up at about 400 at this point, of just women's page editors. The number one reason they didn't get married were things like that. They'd have to give up the things that they had achieved. So this discussion of the ERA, right, was incredibly important. And considering that Virginia passed the ERA this week, right, and what that means is that the things they spoke about and fought for have not gone away, right? They're not small things. And I felt so bad that all the women I study have died because I couldn't imagine how excited they would have been for what happened in Virginia this past week. And so as I looked at these women, again, are they outliers? I like this Jeannie Volz I mentioned to you. Or were they all like this? So one of my favorite women is Maggie Savoy. She was a very good friend with Marie Anderson, who I mentioned to you earlier. She and Marie started doing studies in the 1950s and 60s to look at how women were being treated at newspapers. And they documented time and again that they were treated poorly. This wasn't just discussions in a hallway of a newsroom. They documented this time and time again and presented this to men who were the heads, because at this point in time, all the publishers were male. There was Kay Graham maybe, but that was about it. Even she wasn't very well respected at that time. These women did not need to be liberated, and I think that's in some ways the saddest part of what I look at. As if women in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s had no idea what was happening to them. That suddenly someone protested a Miss America pageant, right? That Betty Friedan's book changed everything. These women knew what was happening, and they cared, and they tried to make a difference, and they did in their communities. pretty consistently if you look at the things that they were doing. Maggie Savoy died 5 days before I was born. And as I mentioned, very few of these women married, had children, had a connection. And so I felt the least I can do is give Maggie a voice. Because she consistently, up until her death, wrote columns about paying attention to things. Because her view, and I think she's right, the concept of equal rights help men too. Better husbands, better fathers, better understanding of things. And that's what she was writing right up until her death. So as I mentioned, that led to my most recent book about women's page editors. I wrote about, like I said, probably 250 in this book, only one jerk. You know how you know someone's a jerk? When they write in their obit, they're prickly. That's how you know. But it was amazing to me that these women did these things, and they almost never left their communities. So they were the most important people in Houston, in Phoenix, in Seattle. They did all of this, and they almost never left, which is unusual for journalists. Often they move around, better job. These women never left. And a large part of it was the concept I heard time and again. Don't ask permission, ask for forgiveness. And that's what they did. These well-behaved women could continue to be well-behaved, but also make a difference. My current work is about fashion editors. As I mentioned to you, there were the 4 F's of the women's pages. And again, this is something else we treat as if it's unimportant, right? How could fashion possibly be important? Well, we get dressed every day, right? So at a very basic level, but it's a business. And if it was something other than what women cared about, it would probably be a more important business to many people. But they also traveled the world. They could make decisions. And they would write things that were outrageous in their time period about how crazy something was. No one's ever going to wear that. They weren't always right. They never thought jeans were going to take off. They weren't always right. But the thing that I often talk to my students about, I mentioned to you Marge Paxson earlier. And my students come to class in pajamas all of the time. It's a different generation. All about comfort, right? But when Marge Paxson became the publisher, the 4th publisher in the Gannett chain, one of the biggest at the time in the country, she walked into the newsroom wearing her one and only fancy suit. She said, I want to look like the female publisher that I imagined in movies. Had the fancy suit on. And the publisher she was taking over for said, I just want you to know there's 2 things that I don't think we should change. 1, we should be against the ERA, and 2, women should never wear pants. This is 1982, by the way. So she went home and put on the only pair of pants she had and walked through the newsroom, walked through every part of the building. And sure enough, the secretary comes running up to her later in the day. Is it true women can wear pants now? And she said, yeah, and we're also for the ERA now too. And it seems like a funny anecdote, right? My students love it. But my favorite part of her story is the second part. She went to Sears the next day. This is back when Sears was where you went for clothes. I know it's different. She went to Sears and she put down her credit card. And this is in Oklahoma. And the clerk said, are you the lady that's going to let those women wear pants? I mean, the ERA was big, but this was about women's lives. And that's what these women did. And no one's going to necessarily care that she allowed them to wear pants or changed the ERA or did all of this. But it did matter. It mattered to these individual women. In fact, Marge told a story that the next day, 40 women wore pants to work. I mean, they didn't even have the ability, right, to do something that we take in so many ways for granted. And that's who these women were. And, you know, my hope every time I talk about them is that we think about these women of that generation because they've been so forgotten. As I mentioned to you earlier, one of the women who I spoke with said, isn't it great that women aren't limited by that anymore? And it is great. My students don't think there's anything they can't do. But it's that kind of sandwich generation, if you were in the middle of that, they get forgotten for what they did to open the doors for that next generation and what they did. So, thank you so much.